They will tell you that black billionaires are a modern invention. They will tell you that black wealth began with entertainment, with sports, with the cultural industries that white America deemed acceptable. They are lying. In 1905, a black man in Chicago controlled a financial empire worth over $50 million in today's money. He did not sing, he did not play, he owned banks, buildings, entire neighborhoods. And when his power became undeniable, they came for him. His name was Jesse Binga. This is the empire they tried to bury, and this is how he built it. Jesse Binga was born in 1865 in Detroit, Michigan, just months after the Civil War ended and Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. His mother had been enslaved. His father was a barber who had purchased his own freedom. From his first breath, Jesse existed in the narrow margin between bondage and possibility. He was not born into wealth. He was born into the wreckage of a nation that had just decided reluctantly that people like him were human. But even as a child, Jesse understood something that would define his entire life. He understood that in America, freedom without ownership was just a longer leash. The Detroit of Jesse's youth was not the industrial powerhouse it would later become. It was a city of small trades and smaller margins. His father's barbershop served a mixed clientele, and young Jesse watched the economics of survival unfold in real time. He saw how white customers paid less respect but demanded more service. He saw how black customers paid what they could, which was often not enough. He learned that the razor's edge between poverty and stability was literally in his father's hands. By the time he was 15, Jesse had already worked a dozen jobs. He had been a porter, a fruit vendor, a barber's assistant, and a boot black. He had no formal education beyond grammar school, but he had something more valuable. He had the ability to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. In 1885, at 20 years old, Jesse Binga made a decision that would change everything. He left Detroit, but he did not go to Chicago. Not yet. First, he went west. He spent nearly a decade wandering the frontier, working as a barber in Oakland, as a porter in Tacoma, and as a peddler in towns whose names have been forgotten. He was not running from anything. He was studying. He was learning how land worked in America, how value was created not through labor alone, but through ownership of the ground beneath your feet. He watched white settlers claim territory and watched that territory multiply in worth. He filed this knowledge away like a weapon he would one day use. In 1893, Jesse Binga arrived in Chicago. He was 28 years old and had almost nothing. But Chicago in 1893 was a city on fire with ambition. The world's Columbian Exposition had just transformed the city into a global showcase. Millions of visitors had poured in, and the infrastructure they left behind created new neighborhoods, new transit lines, and new opportunities. More importantly, Chicago was becoming the destination for Black Southerners fleeing the terrorism of the post-Reconstruction South. The Great Migration had not yet reached its peak, but the trickle had begun. Jesse saw what was coming before anyone else did. He saw that Black people would need places to live, and he saw that no one was building for them. Jesse started with a fruit stand on State Street. The margins were thin, but the location was strategic. He was in the heart of what would become Bronzeville, the Black metropolis. He saved every penny. He wore the same suit until it nearly fell apart. He ate one meal a day when money was tight. Within 2 years, he had saved enough to make his first real estate purchase. It was a single building on State Street. It was not impressive. It was not valuable by any conventional measure, but it was his, and ownership, Jesse understood, was the only language America truly respected. What Jesse did next was a masterclass in contrarian economics. White homeowners on the South Side were terrified of the growing black population. They were selling their properties at a discount, desperate to flee before their neighborhoods changed. Jesse bought those properties. He bought them cheap, renovated them, and rented them to the black families who had nowhere else to go. He was not exploiting his own people. He was providing the only housing they could access in a city that had drawn a hard line around where black bodies were allowed to exist. He charged fair rents, he maintained his buildings, and he reinvested every dollar into acquiring more. By 1905, Jesse Binga owned more property on the south side of Chicago than any other black man in America. He controlled entire blocks. His real estate portfolio was valued at over $1 million, the equivalent of more than $30 million today. He had done this without inheritance, without investors, without any of the institutional support that white businessmen took for granted. He had done it with patience, discipline, and a ruthless understanding of how fear could be converted into opportunity. But Jesse was not satisfied. Real estate was just the foundation. What he wanted was something far more dangerous. He wanted to control where the money itself was kept. He wanted a bank. In 1908, Jesse Binga opened Binga Bank. It was the first black-owned bank in Chicago and one of the first in the entire North. The white banking establishment watched with a mixture of amusement and contempt. They gave him 2 years before failure. They were wrong. Binga Bank did not just survive, it thrived. Within a decade, it held deposits exceeding $1 million. Black teachers, black doctors, black porters, and black domestic workers finally had a place to save their money where they would not be humiliated, scrutinized, or turned away. Jesse had created more than a financial institution. He had created dignity in brick and marble. The bank's success accelerated everything else. Jesse used the deposits to fund more real estate acquisitions. He bought apartment buildings, storefronts, and commercial properties. He created a vertical empire where black tenants paid rent to a black landlord who deposited that money in a black bank that funded more black-owned properties. The money stayed in the community. It circulated. It multiplied. By 1920, Jesse Binga's personal fortune was estimated at over $2 million. His real estate holdings stretched across hundreds of properties. The Binga State Bank was now one of the most successful black-owned financial institutions in American history. Jesse had proven that black capitalism was not a fantasy. It was a weapon. But weapons attract enemies, and Jesse Binga had made powerful ones. The white real estate establishment had watched him transform neighborhood after neighborhood. They had watched property values rise under his management. They had watched the black population grow into an economic force that could no longer be ignored, and they decided that Jesse Binga had to be stopped. From 1917 to 1921, Jesse's home was bombed 6 times. 6 times. Explosives were thrown through his windows, planted on his porch, and detonated in the night. His wife Eudora, the sister of legendary heavyweight champion Jack Johnson, refused to leave. Jesse refused to sell. They slept in a house that had become a battlefield, and every morning they woke up, they sent the same message: "We are not going anywhere." The bombings were not random acts of hatred. They were coordinated terrorism designed to break a man who could not be bought or intimidated. The police investigated nothing. The newspapers reported little. Jesse was fighting a war with no allies in positions of power, but he kept buying, he kept building, he kept lending. The community rallied around him, and Bronzeville continued to grow. By the mid-1920s, the black metropolis was one of the most vibrant centers of African-American life in the nation. Jazz clubs lined the streets. Black newspapers commanded national readerships. Black businesses employed thousands. And at the center of this economic ecosystem stood Jesse Binga, the man who had made it possible. Then came 1929. The stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. Banks across America failed by the thousands. But the Binga State Bank did not fail because of the Depression alone. It failed because it was murdered. White banks had always refused to extend credit to Jesse Binga's institution. When the panic began, black depositors rushed to withdraw their savings just like everyone else. But unlike white banks, Jesse had no access to emergency liquidity, no federal support, no interbank lending. The system that had tolerated his success in good times strangled him the moment the economy turned. In 1930, the Binga State Bank was forced to close its doors. Jesse Binga lost everything: his bank, his properties, his fortune. Decades of work evaporated in months. But the final blow was yet to come. In 1933, Jesse Binga was indicted on charges of embezzlement. The accusation was that he had used bank funds to cover personal real estate losses. The trial was a spectacle designed to humiliate. The man who had once been the richest black man in Chicago was paraded before a courtroom as a criminal. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served 3 years before being paroled. When he walked out of Stateville Penitentiary in 1938, he was 73 years old. His wife had died. His empire was gone. The properties he had assembled over decades now belonged to others. The bank he had built from nothing was a memory. Jesse Binga, the titan of Black Chicago, was left with nothing but his name. And even that, the history books were preparing to erase. Jesse Binga did not disappear after prison. He refused to. For the next 12 years, he lived in Chicago, watching the community he had built continue without him. He worked odd jobs. He attended church. He walked the streets of Bronzeville, where his buildings still stood, now owned by others. He never complained publicly. He never blamed the system that had crushed him, at least not in ways that were recorded. But he also never stopped believing in what he had proven. In 1950, Jesse Binga died in Chicago at the age of 85. He was buried with little ceremony. No monuments were erected. No schools were named after him. The man who had once controlled millions died in obscurity, and the city moved on as if he had never existed. The erasure of Jesse Binga was not an accident. It was a consequence of how American history has always treated black wealth that threatens white supremacy. His story was inconvenient. It contradicted the narrative that black poverty was a natural condition rather than an engineered outcome. If Jesse Binga could build a bank in 1908, if he could accumulate millions through discipline and strategy, then the myth of black economic incapacity collapsed. So his name was quietly removed from the textbooks. The bombings were forgotten. The bank failure was framed as mismanagement rather than systemic murder. The lesson his life taught was too dangerous to preserve. But some things survived. The Binga State Bank building still stands on State Street in Chicago. It is now a landmark, though most people who pass it have no idea what it represents. Some of the apartment buildings Jesse constructed still house families today. The infrastructure of Bronzeville, the streets and the commercial corridors, and the institutional density, all of it was shaped by his vision. More importantly, the model he created influenced a generation of black bankers and businessmen who came after. The concept of the circulating dollar, of keeping black money in black institutions, did not die with Jesse Binga. It evolved. It seeded credit unions, mutual aid societies, and eventually the modern push for black economic self-determination. What Jesse Binga's life proves is simple and devastating. Black wealth in America was never allowed to compound. Every generation that built something was met with fire, legal assault, or systemic exclusion designed to reset the clock to zero. Jesse accumulated more than enough to create a dynasty. His children should have inherited an empire. Their children should have expanded it. Instead, one man's lifetime of work was erased in 3 years, and his descendants started over with nothing. This is the pattern. This is the design. Tulsa's Black Wall Street was burned in 1921. Rosewood was destroyed in 1923. Seneca Village was seized for Central Park. The through line is clear. Black wealth is not a failure of effort. It is a target of policy. Today, Chicago's South Side still bears the marks of this history. Bronzeville is undergoing gentrification, with property values rising and long-term residents being displaced. The irony is bitter. The land that Jesse Binga bought cheap because white people were fleeing black neighbors is now being bought by developers who see profit in the culture those black neighbors created. The cycle continues, but there is also a growing movement to reclaim the narrative. Historians and community activists are working to restore Jesse Binga's name to its rightful place. His story is being taught again. His bank is being remembered not as a failure, but as a fortress that held until the ammunition ran out. Jesse Binga was the richest black man in Chicago in 1905. He was a banker before black people were supposed to understand finance. He was a real estate mogul before black people were supposed to own property. He survived 6 bombings, a depression, a rigged trial, and 3 years in prison. And when he walked out, he still believed in the possibility of black economic power. He did not live to see vindication. But vindication was never the point. The point was proof. And Jesse Binga proved beyond any doubt that a black man from nothing could build an empire that terrified the most powerful forces in America. They had to destroy him. That tells you everything about what he built. His name was Jesse Binga. And now you know his story. Which forgotten empire should we uncover next? Let us know in the comments. And do not forget to like and subscribe for more untold histories. We will see you in the next one.